Welcome to our live web event. Today's topic is factory fires, the supply chain's most frequent risk factor. We're going to talk about what you need to prepare your organization and provide supply chain disruption in the case of a factory fire. There's been a lot of factory fires in the news lately, and I'm going to let Matt dig into that. Matt, let's go to the next slide. You're primarily going to hear from Matt Mills. He's our Director of Supply Chain Solutions. He's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He's got a lot of experience in supply chain. My name is Grover Ryder. I'm the host here, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Resolink. Next. So let's get back just a little bit. Before we talk about factory fires, let's give 30 seconds to supply chains. You've got your enterprise at the top of the supply chain. You make things. You manufacture things. You provide critical goods and finished goods to the industry. At Tier 1, you have a lot of suppliers. I put 100 to 10,000. There's probably no major manufacturers that have 100 suppliers. They have thousands. But you have direct suppliers. And as you're well aware, those suppliers have sub-suppliers to them. And below that, there's the Tier 3 to Tier N. It goes all the way down to raw materials. Next. And you have probably 100% visibility of your Tier 1 suppliers. I would be very surprised if anyone in this call but can't just log into their ERP, find all of their direct suppliers, and find critical contacts and what you buy from them and what volume. You have a lot of visibility. Typically, you have partial visibility into Tier 2. You do not have great look into Tier 2 and figure out what's going on, but you have some visibility. Tier 3 and below is where it gets really opaque. You just know very little. Most companies have no way of knowing about Tier 3. Next. And one more. And so then there's this challenge, which is that there's a lot of risk factors. We're talking about one of them right now, factory fires and earthquakes, all kinds of extreme weather, political instability, financial risk, logistics risk, mergers, acquisitions, labor action, all kinds of things can be affecting your supply chain. In addition to which, all of these sub-tiers are changing constantly. You have direct control over what changes at Tier 1. You supply chain people choose who's at Tier 1. You don't always choose who's at Tier 2 and Tier 3. And so this is constantly changing. This big network of data is changing at a constant pace. And so what Matt's going to do is he's going to dig into how factory fires can impact you, not just at Tier 1, but in Tier 1 and all the sub-tiers. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Grover, and thanks everyone for joining. So as you probably may know, I mean, as part of our Event Watch service, we're tracking, supply chain events that are happening around the world on a 24/7 basis. And up until honestly last year, 2016, factory fires and explosion have always been the most frequent potentially disruptive supply chain event that we've been tracking. And you can see that 2017 was a particularly busy year for supply chain fires, with over 343 that we detected. That's about one per day. And you can see it really pales in comparison to some of the other ones. M&As and business sales and spin-offs are kind of slow burning, not really kind of gradual impact type events. Whereas a factory fire, one per day, if that's on a critical component or a critical sub-tier supplier, that can be very impactful to your supply chain. So, how do we manage this? And if you don't believe me, just this week, since Monday of this week, we detected 3 suppliers. So it's Wednesday, so that's right on the one per day pace. So there was a fire at a small factory in Mesquite, Texas, a fire at the port in Bali, India, and then a fire at the Ford Motor Assembly plant in Kansas City, Missouri. And you can see, there's various disruptive potentials here. But the thing is, you never really know how a fire is going to impact you, and sometimes it can take weeks to even understand or even realize the impact. And so, because of that, there's a number of factors that go into making addressing fire risk extremely challenging. But it's something that even if you can't catch every fire or you can't fully ever avoid it, you have to do your best, and you have to look down as many tiers as possible, and you have to understand what that fire risk is. So A couple things to think about here and why it's so challenging is first, fires are hyper-local. Like, it's one fire at one point. It's not a wide-ranging storm. It's not a power outage. It's a fire at a specific plant in a specific point of the world that typically does not, go beyond the four walls of that particular facility. Suppliers also may not disclose a fire. I mean, we do a great job of, we scan over 2 million news events a month and detect, 300 different fires a year. But that probably pales in comparison to the actual number of kind of fire-related industrial accidents that happen that don't actually make the news, that don't actually make our social media or public source scanning. So suppliers may have a fire and may not even know it, which is why having fire prevention expectations is really important when you're looking at evaluating your supply base. Impact from the fire or the explosion may not be felt for weeks. So if there's a minor fire, the supplier may need to make a change to a line. Sometimes fires and explosions can trigger regulatory crackdowns on certain areas. I don't know if you guys remember in 2014 there was a GM supplier in China in the Suzhou area, I believe, that had an explosion due to some combustible dust. And the Chinese government actually, or the local government actually came in and inspected all of the facilities that were creating dust and shut down a lot of those factories for weeks until they could figure out their dust mitigation plan. So even if a fire occurs and you don't feel any impacts, there are definitely knock-on effects that can create impacts in the future. Even a small fire can make a material impact. I mean, especially in some of the high-tech or clean room type industries in the medical devices or some of the medical fields. You get a speck of dust into some of those clean rooms, and that can impact supply and that can impact production because it takes time to clean all that up. So even if there's a small fire, the impact of that can be wide-ranging, and again, you may not even hear of it. And the fifth thing is we can't rely on the governments to make sure that, I think we hope that, the government is trying to protect workers. But what I've learned is fire prevention regulations are highly variable from country to country, locality to locality. For instance, in Brazil, a lot of municipalities don't even require sprinkler systems. They only require that the factory have access to a water source and fire extinguisher. So you can't rely on every building code in every locality that your supplier is doing business to be making the best decisions based on preventing fires. And then lastly, fires kill. Fire safety can severely harm and injure the employees if it's not taken seriously, which can be a huge reputational risk to not only your supplier's company but also your company if you're not taking an interest in setting expectations as to what they should be doing. So just to kind of take a step back and do a little fire one-on-one here. I'm not an EHS professional, but I'm going to do my best to talk through kind of the elements of fire risk, right? So the fire triangle is really heat, oxygen, and fuel. In order to have a fire, you need all three of these things, which create a chain reaction, which then creates the fire. And as you know, I mean, you can't escape. Every factory has to have oxygen in it. Every factory probably has a little fuel in it. The question is, how are we managing our heat sources or our ignition sources? So that's where having sound hot work permits, permit systems, and fire mitigation, and making sure that the heat and the fuel are segregated and never come into contact with each other. That's just good fire safety practices. And then the explosion pentagon. So this takes, if you look on the left-hand side here, we see fuel, oxygen, ignition. But then when you combine with it dispersion and confinement, so if you have very fine fuel particles that are dispersed over a confined area, then that's a recipe for an explosion. So when you think about any manufacturing processes that create dust, any potential chemical or gas leaks that can come in contact with the fire triangle, that's when an explosion occurs. So as you're thinking about your manufacturing processes and the the suppliers that use them. Keep these things in mind as you evaluate those processes to make sure that you have a handle on where your fire risk might be. Because every commodity and every product category, and even to some degree, every supplier, depending on the process that they use, their fire risk and their vulnerability to fire can be very, very different. There are really 5 major causes of industrial fires. So thinking about how, if your suppliers are managing these appropriately and where these appear in your supply chain processes are really key to managing this risk. So the first is combustible dust. We've talked about this before. So making sure that if you have a process that creates combustible dust, that your suppliers have a dust mitigation system in place. So a lot of packaging facilities have, they're sawing a lot of wood, so they can have a lot of dust flying around. Die cast parts on the metal side create a lot of dust in the polishing process. So understanding where that combustible dust lives, and you can leverage your engineering teams where they exist to help understand where the combustible dust risk can be. That can be really important. Hot work is pretty straightforward. So anything that's creating fire or sparks is hot work, and you have to make sure that you have a proper hot work permit system in place that you're keeping. And what a hot work permit system does is it makes sure that the ignition source stays segregated from the fuel source, so that you don't have the fire triangle come into effect, and you're not doing welding next to a bucket of greasy rags, those types of things. Flammable liquid gas is also pretty straightforward, and a lot of companies have a pretty good handle on what goes into their products as far as what liquids, gases, etc. are used in the formulation of their products. What a lot of companies don't have a good handle on necessarily are the process chemicals that are used in their manufacturing processes. And I know there's a lot of work going on, particularly in the sustainability world, to understand those process chemicals. But those process chemicals can be just as dangerous and disrupt your supply chain just as easily as the ingredients that go actually into your products. Electrical, making sure that the suppliers, have regular electrical inspections, that they're maintaining their electrical, they're keeping their factory infrastructure up to date is important. And then obviously machinery and equipment, anything that creates friction, obviously creates dust, which we've talked about. If you have certain machines that are rubbing things against each other and they're not properly maintained or properly lubricated, that can create an ignition source and be the source of a factory fire as well. So how do we assess the fire risk in our supply chain? So we have kind of a 4-step process that we're recommending, but really the key to success is asking the right questions. And all the things you're going to see here are about asking questions and being more creative in how you ask questions and hold your suppliers accountable to answering them. So the first is being able to conduct a fire risk assessment. So we actually have a factory fire risk survey we can help you administer to your suppliers. And what that survey really does is helps assess your suppliers for exposure to the 5 causes of fires we just talked about, and also what are their safety and prevention capabilities. You can see some of the sample questions here. It's a combination of the prevention and the safety and the causes and where they exist. And then that can create a risk score for you to help you understand where your highest areas of fire risk are, so you can start applying some of the other techniques we'll talk about in a second. As far as, if you have, thousands of suppliers and you're not really sure how to prioritize them or who are the bad actors, as I said before, you can use your engineering teams to help you understand kind of at a high level what are the commodity or the category groups that use some of the processes that we talked about. And that can help you kind of hone your focus to start collecting this data and understanding where your high fire risk suppliers are. And then second of all, as we talked about if you're in the last webinar, having a sound business continuity management program and expecting that of your suppliers is really key to addressing any risk. And so you can see that I don't think the statistic at the top is a surprise to anyone. But when we look at some of the information that we've collected about supplier business continuity plans over time, we see some pretty scary statistics in the lower half there. So sites without business continuity plans, sites without IT disaster recovery plans, sites without backup power, and then almost a quarter of the sites score pretty poorly on poor fire and safety, which makes honing in on this, because it's more frequent, because there's hundreds of these a year. helping to understand which of the sites in your supply chain need a little bit of help and need to be paid attention to with regard to fire and safety is really important.
And Matt, I hate to interrupt. I got to tell you, I'm getting flooded with questions on this slide right now. People are asking, can they get this kind of visibility? If, can we help them get it? I mean, I must have 5 questions.
Yeah, so, we can. So, as I said before, we have the specific fire assessment survey that we can help you collect through our technology and our solution, and our services. And we also have a much broader ISO 22301 based business continuity survey that we can help you to collect this information and understand where the specific gaps are in your suppliers and your supply chain.
And so they can get not only overall, and that's the question I'm getting, can they get roll-up numbers, but they can actually see down to the suppliers themselves and the sites, is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah. We've collected, thousands of business continuity surveys in particular already, that we can actually, with the supplier's permission, we can share with customers between the clients. So they don't have to fill out multiple surveys. As long as the supplier gives us permission to share with another mutual customer, then we have the ability to do that. So we're really trying to reduce the fatigue around this. And again, it's all based on a common standard, so these aren't unique questions or shouldn't be difficult for suppliers to complete.
Thank you.
Sure. And the next thing to understand is most of you probably have property insurance, and most of that property insurance probably comes with some sort of supply chain disruption coverage. It's pretty common that that's bundled in these days. And so your property insurers actually care a lot about your supplier factories not burning down. And so they're being able to leverage those resources. A lot of the times they'll give those to you for free, and they'll actually be able to send their engineering teams on site for you and do some inspections of the supplier fire prevention capabilities, whether it's sprinkler systems or water supplies or evaluating the hot work permit process, all the things we talked about that maybe you don't have the budget or the travel time to go assess for each supplier. You can leverage your property insurers to go help you do this for you. So if you need help engaging them, then let us know, because we have some techniques and we can kind of guide you as to what are the types of things that they want. I mean, they're going to want to look into your program and understanding how you've assessed the suppliers and what you're doing about fire risk. But once they understand that, most of the time it's to their mutual benefit to get a look inside some of their supplier sites or some of your supplier sites. And so they'll provide that service for you, and then you can manage the corrective action with the supplier to make sure that they're addressing any gaps on a very specific basis. And it can result in improved supply chain coverage. So a lot of insurers suffer from a lot of information gaps, which makes your coverage costs go up. But once you address those information gaps, then a lot of times you can leverage that into improved coverage. The last thing is, when we talk about supply chain risk, we really want to make sure that you're building consensus for it across the organization and not just looking at it with regard to disrupting your supply chain, because you have a lot of resources internally that also know a lot about factory fires, and those are typically your corporate social responsibility teams and your EHS teams. Most supplier codes of conduct have a fire prevention and safety consideration in them because they're concerned about worker safety. Most of your companies will have the EHS standards with regard to their internal operations, and so you can leverage both those policies as well as kind of build some consensus and drive kind of a unified front to provide additional leverage when it comes time to engage the suppliers on corrective action. It's always important to understand where the cross-pollination of the work that you're doing with regard to supply chain risk is, and I think your CSR and EHS teams can be really valuable for that, particularly in this instance. So this might look familiar to you from the last presentation, but so when the fire happens, I mean, your basic, it's an event response preparation, right? So understanding what parts are mapped to a site, what products they're related to, what your alternate sources are, engaging the procurement and supply chain engineering teams, the engineering teams, particularly if they have to qualify an alternate supplier, making sure that they're involved, assessing inventories, and proactively contacting your customers to tell them that, yes, you realize there's a fire, or and that what you're doing about it can be really important. Like I said, I mean, these things can linger on for months and can have a number of knock-on effects. So making sure that you engage your teams early and keep them accountable for keeping up with the supplier and making sure that the supplier is doing the right things going forward is really important. And then thinking about when a fire does occur, or if you're caught off guard by a couple weeks later and you didn't know that X tier 2 supplier was impacted by a fire. Think about how you could redress that in the future and what that assess phase would look like and what additional data a company like Resolent can help you collect to address the situation better in the future. And then the last point I want to make is fires are almost always preventable. I mean, if your factory gets struck by lightning, obviously that you can't help that. But we talked about the fire triangle. For the most part, those three things are well within a supplier's control, and even some of the 5 common root causes are as well. So be sure you hold your suppliers accountable to not only find the root cause of why the fire occurred when it occurred, but also require them to disclose it to you and to correct it. Ask for the proof that's been corrected. We talked about the regulatory changes. Kind of think about what the knock-on effects can be depending on what that root cause is that can impact the factory operations or related factories in the same that are building the same or similar products could happen. And then I mean, one of the things when I talked about the GM fire explosion and we had all the factory shutdowns as a result of the die-cast suppliers who were creating too much dust, and the Chinese government had to come in and shut them down. Like, we actually worked on designing die-cast products out of our supply chain because of the dust that they created and the fire risk that was associated with it. You can't do that for every part, obviously, but think creatively around where your high fire risk is, and the most important thing to do is just remove the problem from your supply chain if you can, and design it out of your supply chain and make sure that your product designs aren't creating additional risk for you that they don't need to. And that's all I had.
Perfect. Matt, I'm going to ask you to go back to slide, I think it's slide 3 or 4, the one where you're showing the variance between these. Thank you very much. One more. Keep going back. So we have the grid of the frequency bar charts. That's it. Okay. So we got some questions. We're going to get to them real quickly. So Matt's a supply chain professional, and he gave you what I'd call a really great overview of the whole fire story. And he ended with this: here's what you can do to control it. Well, there's a whole bunch of Matts in the world. And the challenge is that they're all working hard to prevent fires, and fires are still the single most frequent disruptor. And so, I'm advocating, along with that, a very, what I call a defensive strategy here, saying you need to get more visibility, and you need to have, better quick alerting, and you need to have impact analysis. So with that in mind, I've got several questions that are clustered around how can you figure out what the impact is from what looks like a small event. So, Matt, you mentioned, and this is the question they're getting, you said a lot of times that these are even unreported at the top level supplier. What can people do to protect themselves from that underreporting, if you will? How can they see into fires if they're not being reported by their own suppliers?
I mean, I think it's, I guess I don't really have a good answer to that. I mean, it's how do you see the unseeable? I mean, I think supplier relationship management comes into play, right? Because I mean, to your point that the fires are still happening even though we all don't want them to happen, and accidents happen, and that's just part of life. But I think that building those trusted relationships with your suppliers, as well as expecting transparency from them. Whether that's expecting them to disclose what their fire safety protocols are, to expecting to disclose where they're building your parts and what redundant supply lines they might have to build your parts with regard to alternate sites, and expecting them to disclose who their suppliers are, so you can work with them directly to make sure that you understand what their vulnerabilities are. I mean, okay, when we talk about sub-tier visibility, we're not talking about, we're not trying to cut anyone out of the supply chain. We're trying to assess our risk. We're trying to get visibility, understand where our risk is, and making sure we build better relationships further down the tiers of our supply chain, so that we're all better off in the end.
Okay, thank you. I got another question, which is, if you do see, like you said, we've got some visibility into the impacts in our own solution, what remediation, if there is a fire and it looks like it's going to have an impact, can they get any remediation out of the Resolink solution? Can they figure out what to do because there was a fire?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things that the solution does, right? So one is you'll be able to understand what alternate sites the supplier has qualified for a particular part. So you'll be able to ask better questions around if you can ship supply to another place. I mean, when I was at EMC, we had a fire at a pretty major supplier, and because we had Resolink, we knew exactly which of the parts were being produced at other sites, so we could proactively make the call to our account managers to make sure that we secured the allocation of the parts coming from those sites. So it's about having that detection capability and being the kind of the first to react and the first to ask, which doesn't always work, but a lot of times it's helpful. And I think it's also some of the mitigation playbooks and just making the whole response process much more efficient, and knowing exactly what parts are mapped to which sites, so that you can compress that discovery period, and when the ashes are still settling at the supplier site, you already know which of your parts are coming from there, so you can start to evaluate your inventories and your open orders and your demand, and start to make decisions much more quickly and much more efficiently and effectively than you could by just hearing it when your supplier gives you a call and not knowing what you have coming from there. Okay.
Thank you very much, Matt. We've got some more what I call detailed private data questions, and we're going to address them directly one-on-one with people. We appreciate very much all the attendees here. There's been a fairly large number, and we have made a recording of this. So we will be sending follow-up answers to people who have private data questions, and we will be sending everybody a link to this event. Matt, thank you very much. You've done heroic work today. You've done 2 of these back-to-back, and people have been sticking to the end, so I think they're seeing a lot of value. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to end this event now, and we will send everybody a link to the recording. Have a great day.